Hello, this is Dr. Morris. I'm doing a review of the avian flu. Remember, the PowerPoint presentation on avian flu is titled The Next Pandemic. I do want you to review the PowerPoint presentation that I have posted on Blackboard for you. But this is extra credit, and I certainly don't want you to be stressed out, especially now a week or two before your final exams. Though I want you to review the PowerPoint presentation, I don't want you to spend the majority of your time on this extra point. Your main focus should be on your final exam. So I did this review for you just to kind of go over some key points. You should write down these key points because this is the information that you'll be responsible for the quiz portion. There are only 15 questions. Remember, you need to get 75% of the answers correct. And if you listen to the PowerPoint presentation and you listen to this quiz review information, you should be able to do just fine on the exam. Similarly, I will be doing a review for the core disaster life support as well. So let's get started with the quiz review. First information I'd like to go over is just some characteristics about the avian influenza or the bird flu. You should recognize that wild birds worldwide carry the viruses in their intestines. You should recognize that the mortality rate associated with the avian flu is about 90 to 100%, and it often kills the infected bird within a 48-hour period. This is a highly pathogenic form of a virus. It spreads more rapidly through flocks of poultry than you see even through wild birds, probably because of the close proximity of those birds, the ability for these birds to transmit the virus to one another through bird droppings. Birds often walk in the same areas where they excrete their waste, and so the virus is easily transmitted that way. You should also recognize that the avian influenza virus is very contagious amongst birds, and it makes some domesticated birds, including chickens, ducks, turkeys, very sick, and will even kill this population of birds as well. Another point that I want to bring out to you, which would be point number 2, how does the avian flu influenza virus spread amongst birds? Well, just as I related to in the earlier point, infected birds shed the influenza virus in their saliva. They also shed it in their nasal secretions. Domesticated birds can become infected with the avian influenza virus through direct contact with infected waterfowl or infected poultry, or through contact with surfaces such as dirty cages. Again, these birds are able to transmit the virus through their fecal products. Birds tend to walk in the same areas where they defecate and eat. Other materials such as water and feed become contaminated with the virus, and so it's easily spread amongst the birds. Point number 3. I would like for you to know about the virus and how it concerns people. How do people become infected with the avian influenza virus? Well, now, most cases of the avian influenza infection in humans has resulted from direct or close contact with infected poultry. For example, domesticated chickens, ducks, or turkeys, or surfaces that are contaminated with the secretion from these birds. Excretion from the infected bird lands on a surface. The individual that is working with the birds comes in contact with this contamination, whether it's from feces or from the secretion of bird, and thus will receive the virus in that manner. The spread of avian influenza virus from an ill person to another person has been reported very rarely, and the transmission is not observed beyond one person. Now, even though it's reported in a rare case of this transmission having occurred from person to person, it's felt that the virus was actually not transmitted that way, that the individual that picked up the virus actually had contact with a domesticated bird. So there's really, I guess, to be perfectly honest, there's probably not a true case of where the avian flu virus is transmitted from person to person, but right now it's reported as a very rare occurrence. During an outbreak of avian influenza among poultry, there's possibly a risk to people who have direct or close contact with the infected birds or with the surfaces that have been contaminated with secretions and excretion from infected birds. So all of the cases reported thus far where there has been an outbreak of avian influenza, it has been the result of a person having direct contact with the birds. Point number 4. What are the symptoms of avian influenza in humans? The symptoms of avian influenza in humans have ranged from a typical influenza-like symptom such as fever, cough, sore throat, muscle aches, which is referred to as myalgias, joint pain, referred to as arthralgias, all the way to infections in the eyes themselves, forms of conjunctivitis. Pneumonia or severe respiratory diseases such as acute respiratory distress syndrome and other severe life-threatening complications have also been reported to have occurred. Other symptoms of the avian flu depend on the specific virus subtype and strain which causes the infection. Point number 5. Which of the following best describes the implications of avian influenza to human health? You should recognize that the risk of direct infection from the virus passes from infected bird to humans, sometimes reflecting in or referring into severe disease. The risk of the virus, if given enough opportunity, will change into a form that is highly infectious for humans and will spread easily from person to person. Okay, so 2 key points on implications of avian influenza to human health. The risk of direct infection when the virus passes from an infected bird to humans, sometimes resulting in severe diseases, though there are reported cases of that in countries in the Far East. The risk of the virus, if given enough opportunity, will change into a form of highly infectious humans and spread easily from person to person. Now remember, this has not occurred yet. This is certainly an implication that we fear will happen with avian influenza virus, but to date this has not happened. But the risk that the virus will have enough opportunity to convert to an infectious form is most definitely true, and this highly infectious form will certainly form and spread from human to human. Point number 6. Which of the following statements is true when we talk about the treatment of avian influenza, especially in humans? Well, the key point that I want to make from this particular point is the drug oseltamivir, which has a trade name of Tamiflu. This is the most commonly sought after drug for the treatment of the avian flu virus. Since it's available in a flu form, the other drug, Zamivir, which is also known as Relenza, is also considered for use, but this drug, Relenza, has to be inhaled. Other antiviral drugs are less likely to be effective in a pandemic influenza. It's also a concern, as you'll see as you review the PowerPoint lecture, that even oseltamivir or Tamiflu, it may not be treatable because there are 2 clades of this virus, so clade 1 and clade 2. Tamiflu only treats one clade, and it's feared that the second clade of this flu will be the one that will be transmitted to humans, and even Tamiflu will not be effective. As far as Relenza goes, or Zanamivir, is felt to be effective also against only one clade. Point number 7. The primary reason to give routine seasonal influenza viruses to poultry workers. You should understand what the key point is in this. It's not that routine seasonal influenza vaccines will protect poultry workers from the avian flu or from any of the avian-related flu viruses. The rationale for vaccinating poultry workers against the common flu is that it will reduce the probability of the common influenza virus recombining with an avian H5N1 virus in the bloodstream of poultry workers, forming a new pandemic strain that can be transmitted from human to human. So if we can prevent the transmission of seasonal influenza, hopefully we will also be able to block this recombining of viruses, this new viral type, this development of a new strain type, a pandemic strain which would cause massive infection and be transmitted from human to human. Another point that I'd like to make is some key points that are related to avian influenza First, there's no evidence that properly cooked poultry or eggs can be a source of infection in avian influenza. Second, the United States government carefully controls domestic and imported food products and have done so since 2004, where they issued a ban on importation of poultry from countries affected by avian influenza virus, including the H5N1 strain. Also, there is a ban currently in place on the importation of poultry from countries affected by avian influenza viruses, including H5N1 strain. There is no evidence at this point, and I'll repeat this, there is no evidence at this point that poultry and poultry products are sources of infection for avian influenza. Now, when I say poultry and poultry products, obviously I mean cooked poultry products or products that are used for human consumption. This is not the source of infection of avian influenza. Point number 9. Which of the following precautions have been recommended from the Center of Disease Control concerning avian influenza precautions? First, the public should observe wildlife, including wild birds, from a distance. This will protect you and possible exposure to pathogens and minimizes disturbances to animals. Secondly, and probably common sense, avoid touching wildlife, especially wild birds. If there is contact with wildlife, don't rub your eyes, don't eat, don't drink, don't smoke before you wash your hands with soap and water. Another common sense item, do not pick up diseased or dead birds. Again, this is common sense, but especially with small children. Small children may pick up a dead animal, particularly a dead bird. Again, if this occurs, the person should wash their hands immediately with soap and water. And finally, contact state, tribal, federal natural resource agencies if you see sick or dead birds. Point number 10. I'd like to describe some of the effects of the pandemic of 1918. The influenza pandemic of I said 1819. Some of the effects of the pandemic of 1918. So the influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919 killed more people than World War I, which was estimated to be somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. It was cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded world history. The shortage were further confounded by the added losses of physicians and nurses who died due to influenza exposure during the pandemic. It would be at least theorized or estimated we would see the same type of loss of life if we had a major pandemic, worldwide pandemic, as we saw during the World War I. Remember, other factors that complicated this disaster were the fact that we had a war that was in progress, and so we had a number of military troops transferring back and forth to the United States overseas. They were carrying the flu virus with them as they were being transported back and forth. More military troops were lost as an effect of the influenza virus than any bullets or any bombs that killed troops during that period of time. I also want to bring up some key points. This will be point number 11 about the pattern of illnesses related to the 1918 influenza pandemic. First, and surprisingly, the flu was most deadly at people between the ages of 20 and 40. Now, this is an unusual finding, and this was pointed out in the PowerPoint presentation. Typically, what we see in influenza viruses are people who are very young, such as infants or children, or people who are very old, the elderly, are typically affected worse by influenza viruses. But the pattern of death related to the flu virus of 1918 and 1919 showed that it was most deadly between the age groups of 20 and 40. Further, the pattern of morbidity, unusual for influenza virus because, again, it usually is a killer of elderly and young children. It infected approximately 28% of all Americans. An estimated 675,000 Americans died of influenza during the pandemic, 10 times as many as died in the World War. Another point that I'd like to make, and this is point number 12, It talks about the influenza type A and how it exhibits subtype variations defined as a particular combination between the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase surface proteins. Now, those of you who have had microbiology are very familiar with hemagglutinin and neuraminidase surface proteins and how these respective designations identify the subtype of the virus. Now, those of you who have not had microbiology can appreciate this as well. If you think about Anatomy Physiology Part 1, when we talked about proteins on the surface of the cell membrane, if you remember, we talked about proteins as a part of the phospholipid bilayer, the covering around the cell, and then that phospholipid bilayer also had protein components that were a part of it. The protein components served as receptors. We also said there were carbohydrates which served as receptors as well, forming a glycoprotein type of a receptor. Well, the receptors on the cell membranes are specific surface proteins which will attract or will bind to certain subtype variations of influenza virus. They will actually stick or adhere to the cell surface or the cell membrane in human cells. So there are only two subtypes, type 1, type 2, or N1, N2, which are typically the type that will infect humans. So you need to be aware of that. N1 through N2, or N1 and N2, typically infect humans. There are only three hemagglutinin subtypes, H1, H2, and H3, which typically infect humans as well. All of the antigenic subtypes may occur in any combination in wild birds such as waterfowls or migratory birds such as wild ducks. And these are, wild ducks or migratory birds, are the primary reservoirs for influenza type A virus. Okay, now that's influenza type A virus. Now domestic fowls, chickens, are usually infected by subtypes of H5 or H7. So my point in this is identifying there are only certain surface proteins, there are certain virus subtype designations that will only infect humans. And thus, this is where we develop the specific name of the avian influenza virus that will affect humans, the H5N1 strain. Point number 13. The consequences of bad pandemic would include which of the following? Well, let's talk about some of the consequences of a bad pandemic, and you should be able to answer this question. Remember, communities attempt to cut themselves off totally from general populations when there are massive epidemics occurring. Now, we have not been exposed to a massive epidemic in the United States, but historically what we have seen during the time of the smallpox epidemic, both in the Western society and worldwide, communities would completely cut themselves off from the general population to avoid exposure to severe viruses. We also see communities become, I'm sorry, I got interrupted here for a second. Okay, sorry about that interruption. I want to get back to point number 13, the consequences of a bad pandemic. And what type of responses do we see in communities? Communities may attempt to cut themselves off from a general population during a widespread pandemic. Now, in the United States, we haven't seen a pandemic in our lifetime, such as the one that we would theorize will occur with the spread of the avian flu virus. Historically, in the times of epidemics such as in smallpox, communities would completely cut themselves off or isolate themselves from the general population to avoid exposure. We also see that communities can easily lose half of their populations due to death. We can also see that communities affected by death, or even those communities not affected by death, which is probably the most key point here, even communities not affected by death can still be affected to a high degree because of illness, bereavement felt by members of the community or their families. We did a study in Saudi Arabia on the adverse health effects related to the 1991 Gulf War exposure, the burning oil well fires and the smoke plume. And even though the most significant amount of smoke plume was in the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, and the people who were most severely impacted lived on the east coast of Saudi Arabia, we saw that even on the west coast of Saudi Arabia there was a psychological impact, mainly because family members were worried or concerned about their loved ones who were in the exposed areas. And that type of experience, that fear that loved ones would be injured, that fear that family members may indeed die from such an exposure, was significant as well. So we would see those same types of consequences if we had a really bad pandemic. Point number 14. When we talk about the influenza variants that lead to avian flu, it's important to recognize that, one, the origin of the influenza variant will not be precisely known. And historically, we're not exactly sure where the influenza virus that derived the avian flu virus, or the bird flu, we're not sure of the origin of that variant either. It's theorized that it originated in China in a rare genetic shift of an influenza virus. The recombination of surface proteins created a virus novel to almost everyone. We can also theorize that if this particular type of virus seroconverts, as we've seen in the bird population, herd immunity in these variants will be lost. Now, the term herd immunity, and again, those of you who have had microbiology know this definition already, but herd immunity refers to when populations of people, significantly large populations of people, have developed immunities to particular viral strains. So when there is a virus exposure, the majority of the community will not get sick because they've already developed antibodies. This is referred to as herd immunity. With the avian flu virus, especially a serotype which will infect humans, we now know that there will be no herd immunity, or there will be a complete loss of herd immunity because no one's ever been exposed to this type of virus before. With the loss of herd immunity, this variant type will be lethal and will be devastating to populations of people. The final point, point number 15, involves personal protection equipment and the use of a mask. Currently, the wearing of a mask is not recommended for routine use in the public, such as preventing forms of influenza exposure. In the United States, disposable surgical masks and procedural masks have been widely used in the healthcare setting to prevent exposure to respiratory infections such as tuberculosis, but the mask has not been used commonly in the community setting, such as in schools, business, or in public gatherings. Those of you may remember when the SARS virus was infecting individuals in China and was felt to be the next pandemic that will invade other countries as well. You may remember seeing clips on television about people wearing masks throughout the population as they got on trains, traveled on buses, drove in cars, or were exposed to other people. Now, these types of masks that were used were probably not effective enough to prevent the spread of the virus. Remember, viruses are very small, so it will take a specialized mask to wear to be able to protect individuals. The use of a simple handkerchief, or the types of masks that you can buy from Home Depot, or even masks that you can get easily in the hospital, will not be the types of masks that would be able to protect you against the influenza virus. The World Health Organization has recommended, and this is a key point, the World Health Organization has recommended that healthcare workers wear an N95 mask and that patients wear surgical masks, which will prevent respiratory secretions from becoming airborne. Now, the purpose of the N95 mask, for those individuals who wear it, this mask will filter out viral elements. The purpose of wearing the surgical mask will prevent respiratory secretions from becoming airborne. It would not necessarily protect that person. You make the assumption that that person already has the virus, so you're just trying to keep the droplets from getting out. But it would not protect, say, a patient that only had on a surgical mask from contracting the influenza virus, nor would that same type of mask protect the healthcare workers. Only the N95 mask would be recommended. Now remember, if the mask becomes contaminated and then it's handled by the individual wearing the mask without that individual washing his hands or her hands, when the mask is removed, then the person can still get exposed to the virus. So obviously, the mask itself can become contaminated. It must be handled as medical waste, removed appropriately, preferably in a negative pressure room, and then discarded as medical waste. Those are the take-home points. If you know those points, you should do fine on the quiz. Thank you very much.